Thank you for being here today. It's my pleasure to introduce the first panelists, and I think I'll probably introduce you one by one as you're going to come up to speak. The first panel titled Museums and Indians, and we have three terrific panelists for this. Just to introduce them very quickly before we start, Rebecca Tsosie from from Arizona State University. Nearly got that wrong. Dr. Dwayne King, who is the director of Gilcrease, and Karen Kramer Russell, who is the curator of Native American Arts from the Peabody Essex Museum. We were talking about the appropriate pronunciation of Peabody for those of us from the Midwest. So let me introduce first Rebecca. We're going to start with Rebecca. Rebecca is a professor of law and the William H. Pedrick Distinguished Research Scholar at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law at Arizona State University, as well as the executive director of the Indian Legal Program and affiliate professor of ASU's American Indian Studies program. I've often thought your business cards are probably very large. Rebecca teaches in Indian law, international indigenous rights, property, bioethics, and critical race theory. Of Yaqui descent, she earned her bachelor's and her law degree from the University of California at Los Angeles. Rebecca is one of the most prolific and horrific legal scholars that I know. She's published widely, both doctrinally and theoretically, on issues relating to tribal sovereignty, environmental policy, and cultural rights, in particular dealing with issues of tribal cultural issues. She's the author of any number of prominent articles. Every time I see a conference agenda, Rebecca is on it. So we are extremely pleased that she made time in her schedule to come and speak with us. Unfortunately, Rebecca's going to have to leave later this morning. She had agreed to miss law school hooding at her university for the first time in the 16 years that she's been there to be at this conference with us today, only to find out just a week or two ago that the students at the law school had voted her Teacher of the Year. And they are presenting that at graduation at 4 o'clock today in Phoenix. So nonetheless, Rebecca came to be with us this morning, and we're extremely pleased that she did. So welcome, Rebecca.
Good morning, and thank you so much, Judy, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to Dean Levitt, to the faculty, the staff, and to Chief Gray for the beautiful welcome introductions and for making the travels here so beautiful. I want to thank the director, Dr. King, for being here with us this morning too in this beautiful place. It's to me a very moving place. Judy brought us through yesterday afternoon because of course I couldn't stay this afternoon to see the museum. And I really appreciated the great care that I see has gone into everything in this environment. It's beautifully done. The interior, the exterior, all of the beautiful works here and the way that the people are represented is beautiful. And I appreciate that very, very much. It's good to be here. I love this law center at Tulsa. I love the faculty so much. Bill Rice, Judy Royster, and most recently Melissa Tatum, who is now, of course, my neighbor to the south at U of A, but was here for a very long time. All of the students here, you do a terrific job, and you do the whole 9 yards in terms of teaching and scholarship and service. So I really commend you for that and for the record that you've built here.
What I want to talk about today, the title of my presentation, at least the working title, Native Nations and Museums Developing an Institutional Framework for Cultural Sovereignty, I think really goes to the heart of what Chief Gray was speaking about in his welcome. And that is that a lot of times we as legal scholars talk about political and legal sovereignty because we have to, right? So we get into that whole discussion of federal Indian law. What does it mean to be a domestic dependent nation? And we get all upset with the United States Supreme Court when they limit tribal sovereignty, and rightfully so. On the other hand, that concept of sovereignty is so deep and so profound. And so when you think about inherent sovereignty, that's not what the United States Supreme Court tells you you are. That is, in fact, what an Indian nation is. That is what we are. That is what we've always been, and that connection with the ancestors, of course, is very, very much a part of that. And so I take it that that was our instruction this morning, and I was very grateful to hear that, because I think that just as the court systems, federal and tribal courts, are institutions that address legal and political sovereignty, museums are institutions that address cultural sovereignty. And when I was thinking about the remarks for this conference, which I've been looking forward to all year, and I have to commend you for the all-star lineup. I mean, this is truly the best of the best minds thinking about these issues that you have assembled here. But as I thought about that, I really began to think about the way that the National Museum of the American Indian, for example, is the federal institution that really addresses Native culture and yet has to work cooperatively with Native communities who are in many cases starting their own museums, which are institutions of cultural sovereignty. So that's the essence of my remarks, is to examine the idea of museums as institutions of cultural sovereignty and to really discuss two themes within that, which I think exemplify much of what's happened, and that is the themes of repatriation and the theme of reconciliation. And Rick West, the first director of the National Museum before my esteemed colleague Kevin Gover took over, he said many, many years ago, because NMAI is the product of the struggle for repatriation, he said repatriation is the most potent political metaphor for the cultural revival that is going on at this time. Political sovereignty and cultural sovereignty are inextricably linked because the ultimate goal of political sovereignty is protecting a way of life and explaining that way of life to others who haven't touched that. And I think that that is a very powerful part of the work of the museum. If you think about exhibits, they represent something about a people and a way of life to other peoples who may in fact never personally meet those people, right? You could go through a display in Washington or Boston and see the people and the way of life represented. And so it's a huge responsibility, and one that I think has a very interesting history and also contemporary articulation. So I want to start by thinking about the National Museum of the American Indian as that institution at the federal level, and I want to be mindful of time, so Judy, you'll give me a wave when okay. As thinking about the National Museum of the American Indian as being that contemporary expression of cultural sovereignty, can a federal institution represent cultural sovereignty? And that was, I think, the challenge that Rick West started with in his term as director. And to think about that, I wanted to see how American museums, first of all, were doing in comparison to European museums in the modern era. And it turned out that there was a very rich literature about Great Britain and France as being those kind of imperialistic nations that went out and, in the words of some, plundered everybody, right? They took stuff from the Greeks. I mean, at least they were equal about it. And they went to Africa and Asia and Egypt and brought back all this stuff, and of course North America too. And both of those nations were now attempting in the 1990s and into the 2000s to redress that colonial imperial history with their museums. So the British Museum in 1999 opened the Chase Manhattan wing that housed all of the things that had been taken from North America. And it was very interesting to read about their thinking in doing that, because it was the expert, right, the curator, who kind of decided that it would be a dialogue about Native and European encounters. And so that's the way they set up the entire hall, but it was meant to redress that history, but really talk about the encounter. And so they covered things like even extinction, they call it, not genocide, extinction of tribes, warfare, etc. So that was very interesting. Then I looked to see what France had done, and it turns out they opened a museum to depict these cultures and Native, Asian, African. And as near as I can figure out, it is set up as a discovery in its design. You go down dark halls and then find the lighted, display as though you are the discoverer on this dark journey and you come into the light with these things. So it was very interesting to see how they did that. Now in America, the museums are also very interesting in redressing the history, much more like Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, because those are settler nations, right? So their effort is to, and has been, to distinguish themselves from Europe and to acknowledge that they are the descendants in some cases of Europe, but also in these new lands, and so they're working with the native peoples here in a multicultural or bicultural, as the case may be, that's the debate right now, process, and that's where the idea of reconciliation comes in, right? So we're getting over the inequalities in that history and trying to represent Native peoples as being part of those nation states, but also distinctive in their cultural identities. And so all of those countries are doing that to some extent. What is interesting to me about the National Museum of the American Indian is that unlike the other countries, really, the United States made the decision to open a separate institution, so not just a wing in an institution, but a separate institution that would stand for the representation of Native cultures, both historic and contemporary. And so the idea of Native peoples as living, as present, as part, and as partners in the design of the exhibits. That also was a very distinctive quality about the National Museum of the American Indian. So, does that mean that we can redress some of the problems in the historical experience of American museums? And I take it that there the critique has been about the way that museums have served to extend the categories of expert, curator, scholar, and subject, the indigenous people. And so that is part of, I think, the National Museum of the American Indian doing a partnership approach to that. What I'm interested in learning more about, and as the course of the conference goes, what are the partnerships formally with tribal museums and the National Museum, I think, because that is a very rich opportunity, I think, to acknowledge cultural sovereignty on the ground in a way that possibly has never been done before, because many Indian nations have not had that opportunity. The other, I think, theme that I see here in terms of the way that things are engaged is the distinction between art and artifacts. So in the traditional American museum, there was fine art, same like Europe, and then cultural objects are designated as artifacts. And I think there's a very good opportunity for an intercultural discussion about what we mean by those terms. And of course, many native languages don't even have a concept of art. So that brought me to the first sort of exploration of the theme of repatriation and what had happened in that process. And I think this has been very important in creating a new set of relationships between Native nations and museums. Prior to 1989, which was the enactment of the statute that led to the National Museum of the American Indian, and that was the first repatriation statute, and then in 1990, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act was passed, which covered other collections. So the NMAI Act covered the Smithsonian, and NAGPRA covered the other federal agencies and federally funded museums. But prior to that time, there was no way for an Indian nation to have a legal right to ancestral human remains, even to the extent that they were named individuals in federal collections, or to the other categories of items that are covered, sacred items used by religious practitioners, and cultural patrimony, which I take it there's still a huge debate about what is central to the culture of Indian nations and is not to be alienated from those nations. That's the essence of cultural patrimony. But prior to that time, no legal right. So any of the repatriations that took place prior to that time were purely what they called as a result of ethical or moral notions about what was the right thing to do. Now that may seem just incomprehensible to a lot of people because now we're so used to the repatriation metaphor, but what does that really mean? If you have a legal right to something, it not only means that you have it in this moment, but it means that that right was denied to you for many, many generations before that. And that is the platform for the discussion of reconciliation. How do we reconcile the legacy of that past? Because that still endures. And so as I looked at the repatriation cases, and I think those will be covered in depth by other people, so I'm not going to discuss those at length, but I saw first this idea in the very early years of NAGPRA, a resistance basically by archaeologists but some museum professionals that somehow this was going to strip collections in museums and we would lose a vast store of knowledge, so there would be the loss of knowledge. Then what I saw in more recent articles was, you know what, we've gained knowledge. And we've come to different types of curation practices where there is a cultural standard of care, right? Because some of those items, as Chief Gray acknowledged this morning, may in fact be left in the custody of museums for cultural reasons, because that is a more it's a more productive way to preserve the interests that the Indian nation has. But what's important about repatriation law is that it leaves that decision in the Indian nation. So no longer is the institution deciding, well, we have to preserve this or that in this way, that the nation is actually engaging in that discussion, saying the cultural standard of care is this. And maybe you have to feed objects, and maybe you have to do other things, and that's okay. That's part of that standard. And also, the way that items are housed in the collection, there's the identity of the object itself, it comes in the cultural context, right? That's how we understand things. In a museum collection, we might just see a collection of pipes, for example, all together, or a collection of moccasins all together. So the original context is lost. Through the process of repatriation and consultation, museums came to know the identity of the objects. So not just what they look like and how they were like or different than other objects, but the true identity. And I think that really has been a very effective mode. Now there are problems, and I think again others will talk about these, but I'm going to leave the repatriation discussion with the one notion. And that is in deciding, for example, what is a sacred object, what is an object of cultural patrimony, those are to be decided in accordance with tribal norms. And that is very, very clear in the legislative history and intent of that statute. But obviously, any category like that is subject to legal interpretation, and so I've been dismayed at some of the arguments over the cultural expression of that. The other problems are centered around ancestral human remains, and the one that is of most concern to me has, I think in the popular media, dealt with ancient Native American remains, so the so-called Kennewick Man in Washington and the so-called Spirit Cave Man who is housed in the collection of the Bureau of Land Management in Nevada. Both of those are ancient Native ancestral remains. But they have been designated, in the case of Kennewick Man, by a court as not Native American because he didn't share the same DNA or culture as modern, federally recognized Native nations. And in the case of Spirit Caveman, he is designated by the BLM as culturally unidentifiable. That is a category under NAGPRA. It's a very problematic category. To my knowledge, there are still not final federal regulations passed to deal with that. There have been many drafts. But what is the central problem? The category of culturally unidentifiable can include so many remains that are clearly Native American, but are not susceptible of being culturally affiliated to an existing modern-day tribe for many reasons. Either because, as in the case of Kennewick Man, they said ancient peoples are not Native American. That's a modern term. We don't know who they were. We don't know anything. We have to do scientific testing to find out who they are. Maybe natives weren't here first. But it also covers all of these other categories. So tribes that were extinguished, tribes that are not federally recognized today but are still in existence. All of those remains are designated currently as culturally unidentifiable in collections, and therefore they cannot be repatriated. So it brings me to the next theme that I want to talk about, which is the theme of reconciliation. How much time? Okay? Okay. Because I want to end by talking about what's happening in Hawaii, which I think is going to bring all of this together. But the theme of reconciliation, to the extent, for example, that we use European constructs to define what is Native American or is not, and that's what's happening in the Kennewick Man case, right? It was pre-European, we don't know. That was recorded history. That is one of those sites for a process of reconciliation, but there are many, many others in the history that led up to NAGPRA to determine how to deal with the inequities that have resulted from that history where remains could be taken from battlefields, and that's the other category of culturally unidentifiable, is all these remains were taken and sometimes housed in big boxes full of crania, full of femurs. They're not labeled, so you don't know. They came from some random place. They may have just a geographical label. That is a wrong that happened, a historic wrong, and it has a contemporary harm to Native people. So how are you going to redress that history? And that's the whole idea of reconciliation. Now, as I looked at what was happening globally, there is an active literature on the role of museums in reconciliation in all sorts of places. So in Ireland, for example, in Northern Ireland, right, the tremendous history of violence there. The Museum of Ulster designed exhibits to show people what their common history was. That's not a battle over ethnicity, it's religion and politics. What's the common history? And can we bring people together in that idea that we are all one today? Same thing happening in South Africa. In the wake of the Truth and Reconciliation process, the government decided to use monuments and museums to inspire a common shared heritage to redress the history of apartheid. And one of the most interesting cases was the site of what was clearly a genocide on a river called Blood River. And there was a whole process that led up to there because that was a victory for the Europeans over the Zulu people. And what ended up manifesting in that was an acknowledgement that the Zulu were and still are a nation, and transforming that monument into a site of resistance. So that was an interesting case study because it didn't result in what the government hoped for, which is that we all come together in a shared history and say, hey, you know, we're okay now. No, the Zulu wanted to claim that identity essentially as a sovereign. And in New Zealand, there was a very interesting, the national government opened the Museum of New Zealand in 1998 to, redress its history with the Maori. And that whole institution was set up to serve what the government said was a bicultural society. And so the Maori and the Pakeha, the non-Maori people in New Zealand. That is the theme of that museum, and it's set up around a common shared land. The people who were there first, the Maori, and the people who were there by treaty, the Pakeha. And that's how they've set up the whole museum, which I thought was amazing. And of course, there was a lot of critique of that, right? Because they said, well, there aren't just two cultures, there are all of these other immigrant cultures, and so it's really multicultural. But the decision they made was that Maoris stood alone in that history of New Zealand, so they weren't just part of the other culture. And this is all happening through the power of the museum, the institution, the portrayal of the history and the people. So, with respect to the National Museum, we obviously have the expert in the room, and I'm sure he'll talk about this later, but I'm actually fascinated with how the National Museum of the American Indian deals with that theme of reconciliation. Is it okay for a federal museum to talk about a history of colonialism? Is it okay for a federal museum to talk about genocide? Is it okay for them to talk about historic trauma? I don't know. But that's part of that process of representing the truth of what happened in a way to heal those wounds by creating a more equitable political structure. So the political and cultural work in tandem. That discussion, interestingly enough, is happening with the proposed African American Museum in Washington, D.C., about the whole history of slavery and historic trauma, and I found those readings very, very interesting. I want to end the presentation by pointing you to an active case study that is ongoing right now and is one of the most powerful case studies that I encountered, and that is what is happening in Hawaii. So if you look at what is happening in Hawaii, there obviously was a kingdom of Hawaii, internationally recognized, not subject to the doctrine of discovery or anything that happened to other Native peoples in the United States. The United States participated in the overthrow of the kingdom, and in fact, Congress apologized for that in a joint resolution in 1993 and said, we are sorry for our role in that illegal coup, imprisoning the Queen. We are sorry for the harms that ensued, and we commit to a process of reconciliation with you. That's what Congress said. It's one of the few cases where Congress has ever committed to reconciliation in the United States. So now what? Well, there's a pending bill that would maybe give them the right to form a governing entity that would be recognized by the United States. That's very, very controversial, though, because there's a huge group of people in Hawaii that are committed to independence, and at the most autonomous level of that, reinstating the kingdom, or at least free association the way that Palau now has with the United States. And that's their idea of reconciliation. So politically, it's unclear how that's going to happen. But what's happening with the cultural institutions? Because cultural sovereignty is alive and well in Hawaii. It really, really is a powerful place for that. And as I look through the literature, there are 3 sites for that process of reconciliation and resistance that is happening right now. The first one is Iolani Palace, where the Queen, Liliuokalani, was imprisoned. And it is now considered a state historical site. But every year on January 17th, the anniversary of the overthrow, it is occupied by Native Hawaiian independence people who say this is still the Kingdom of Hawaii. That piece of ground is still the Kingdom of Hawaii, and we want it back. Repatriation. The second is the Bishop Museum, which has the largest collection of Native Hawaiian remains and cultural objects, and has been the most active museum in the process of repatriation because Native Hawaiians are under NAGPRA. But when you look at the cases that have ensued, and I think Dr. Bailey was on the review committee in one of those cases, which maybe he'll share with you, the Forbes case, artifacts, that's what they were called. That is really a problematic history, right? Because there, the designee for repatriation is Native Hawaiian Organization, and there are many. Hui Malama and the Native Hawaiian Islands Burial Council, they initially got the repatriation, which was called a loan, of these items which are designated as funerary objects that were buried in the cave, and they reburied them. And then later in time, a claimant came in, a Native Hawaiian group, saying, no, that was art. It wasn't artifacts, it was art, not funerary objects, art. And we want it back. And so they actually went to the place of reinterment and got the items back. And they're in the museum now pending disposition. So there's a very active resistance about repatriation and the nature of the cultural obligations with respect to these items in Hawaii. So that's the second site. And the third one, turns out, was the National Museum of the American Indian, which takes a very broad hemispheric approach to Native peoples, not just the United States, hemispheric, and designates Native Hawaiians as part of those Native peoples, and they were part of the opening ceremonies. And there was a really active exchange between the independence advocates who were basically saying, we don't want to be indigenized because our identity is the Kingdom of Hawaii, and other Native Hawaiians who said, no, we're indigenous peoples, we're Native peoples, and we are the keepers of the West, which I think is how that was physically set up at the site. So it was a very powerful discussion, and it shows you the importance of museums as sites for an intercultural dialogue about identity, about politics, about culture that is both internal to a people, as that debate with Hawaiians amongst themselves was, and also external with other peoples and constituencies. So they're very powerful, powerful sites for that discourse to happen, and it is a very courageous form of work. So for all of you that are engaged in the leadership on behalf of Native communities, on behalf of museums, or participating in other aspects of that process, I really commend you for that work. And I thank you all for being here this morning. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you to Rebecca. No mystery why they voted you the Teacher of the Year. So thank you very much.